American intonation is one of the topics that I get requested the most. It's also one of the ones that cause the most anxiety. And I think what people are anxious about is that they don't know where to emphasize. Because with English, and this is something you want to analyze about your own native language, some languages, every word has the same weight. Other languages, sometimes a certain syllable, like in English, a certain syllable will have a stronger emphasis than another. And then on top of that, in a sentence, the musicality, think about it this way. Do you ever hear people speak and you kind of know, like, oh, I bet you that's someone who's Italian? You don't know Italian, but you recognize the rhythm. And so that's what I mean by rhythm. Every language has their distinct way of speaking. And even within each country, there are regions that speak a little bit differently. So today, what we're going to explore is how American intonation patterns will help you sound more natural. Also, how it can help you be more yourself. Because intonation has a big part to do with personality. It's not just purpose of communicating a message, but at this level, it's also about you feeling like you can be yourself in English, that you're allowing people to see you for who you are. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people are so focused on speaking correctly in English that you might sound a little bit robotic. And you don't move your body too much, and maybe you're trying to pronounce everything correctly. And technically, that's perfect English, but it's not your personality. So what intonation training like today's is going to do, it's going to help you find ways to play around with your practice so you can find your voice. So not only is it American intonation, but it's your intonation. Are you confident? Are you energetic? Are you sarcastic? Do you have more of a dry humor tone? Are you maybe a little bit more reserved? These are all things that you can include in your practice so that you feel confident that you are showing people yourself. It's not always about, like, I always get the question of do you need to speak like a native speaker? And what I always tell people is what you really want to know is how to speak English in a way that you can be yourself comfortably. Because that's what speaking like a native speaker means. It's that you can be yourself in any situation. So intonation is really helpful. So let's see our first example. So for this one, and if you're watching the video later, make sure you're pausing and reading this out loud. Joseph, go ahead and read this out loud as I'm speaking. So first, you're going to look at the sentence. When you're looking at an English sentence like this, it can be easy to read it robotically because you end up falling into the pattern of perfecting each word. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the wrong time or the time wrong. So when you pause the video, if that's how you sounded when you practiced, that's what you were doing. You were focusing on each word. So the way that I coach intonation is very visual. And this is what I find is most effective for people. This is something I want you to explore and see if it's good for you. For you, breaking it down this way, maybe you prefer something brighter or color-coded, play around with it. So let me show you what I do. What I do is I break it down visually, and for American intonation, I would say the rule of thumb is we kind of speak in chunks of 2 to 5 words. So that's usually how I like to remind people, like, okay, like, of course, there's always an exception. Sometimes you want to emphasize just one word, or maybe it's a long chunk, but mostly American intonation will be every 2 to 3 words is a chunk. And you'll be able to say that chunk, that section in one breath. So let's take a look at how I would divide this. So when I say visual, this is what I mean. I break it down. I recommend when you're doing this kind of training, do it in like a Word document so you can easily play around with how you break it. And notice here, the longest section or chunk is 5 words at the top. When I say this is not an exact science, I mean, there are other ways that you can break this down. So today you're going to see what I mean by that and then how you can personalize this experience for yourself. So now that you see this, I want you to pause the video and read this out loud. So maybe here you're reading it like this. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. No, if that was you, That's okay for this moment, but that's not what I actually want for you. I'm not breaking this down to read it like poetry. I'm breaking this down so you know where to breathe. And when I say breathe, this is really important, so let me make myself bigger. When I say breathe, I mean a tiny inhale. You don't have to exhale because speaking is the exhale. This is something that people don't understand until I preach it. How important for the way that you breathe, how important that is to your fluency. A lot of people think, oh, I need a breath, which means it's not natural. Think about it if I applied it to this. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon. I mean, that sounds ridiculous. So when I say a micro inhale, I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. Now, as you're practicing, for example, as I was doing that, I think, you know what? I probably only need to breathe like the first and third line. So that's where you start figuring out where the most natural moments are for you. And again, it depends. If I'm having a conversation with someone, then of course I maybe don't need to breathe as much. If I'm on stage giving a speech, I definitely want to breathe more because that helps me have a more clear pace that people can understand me in that TED Talk speaker way. Now, in addition to breaking it down visually, we also want to kind of play around with what word we emphasize or what syllable we emphasize per line. Now, it can be very tempting to take this and exaggerate it. So I don't want you to sound like, I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. Like, you can hear it, right? Like it's tempting to, when I say emphasize, to go overboard. Emphasis is very subtle. Sometimes you can emphasize something by slowing down. Sometimes you emphasize something by being louder. Sometimes it's just a very subtle rhythm. So I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. So notice there, things are starting to flow a little more naturally. It's not about punching each word that's highlighted. It's just giving you a guide for a rhythm. And as always, this is not an exact science. There are ways that you might highlight different words. Here's another example where the visual can be malleable. It can be changeable. Instead of doing these longer sections, if that's still causing you to feel anxious or you're not feeling your most natural self, break it down more. As long as when you read it out loud, you're not stopping. I thought we were meeting. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. Basically, it's just a guide to help you feel more in control and to help you understand the patterns of natural American English. So again, there are multiple ways you can break it down. As a rule of thumb, again, to remind you, maybe 2 to 5 words is usually what I recommend. And it also depends on the intent on the audience. This is a really casual sentence, so I'm not going to read it. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon. You have to visualize, right? Okay, I'm at work, I'm with my coworker, and I showed up late to lunch. Like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. Please forgive me. So notice when I make the visualization, because I'm apologizing, that was a whole different energy to it. Maybe you want to visualize you showing up early and like, oh, no, don't worry. I thought we were meeting for lunch at noon, but I guess I got the time wrong. Don't worry, you're not late. Make sure you add visualization and contextualization to your practice. You are now advanced. You're not studying this so you can pass a test. You're studying this so that you can sound like yourself and feel fluent and like you are authentic. So now let's look at our next example here. Go ahead and pause the video if you're watching this later and read it out loud. Now here, the reason I remind you to breathe is because when we're doing this kind of practice, it can be very tempting to start tensing your shoulders. It can be very tempting to I have to do this correctly. We're doing natural English. So relax your shoulders. The first time you read it, even for myself, the first time is always awkward. You don't know what the sentence is about. You don't know the context. You're still kind of figuring out the message. So it's okay that it feels awkward. And it's okay if it sounds awkward. But now, looking at this, the first sentence we did was more conversational. This one's more of a business example. So already I'm putting myself in like, okay, I'm probably at the office. Here, I'm going to visualize like I'm the team lead. I'm in a meeting and I need to be, authoritative and persuasive. So now that you know the tone, let's divide it. So here, this is one example of how you can break it down. And remember, there are different ways. As you notice here, you'll notice the pattern. Usually it'll be about 2 to 5 words per chunk. Okay, so now pause the video. Go ahead and practice reading it on your own. Okay, so now that you've done it the first time, I think by now you're already seeing how your practice is changing. You're probably not reading it as robotically as the first time. I'm hoping that you're not reading it like after reviewing the data, I believe we should adjust. So if you are, this is just your moment to remember we want to have it smooth, melodic, really bring in the connected speech practice that we had from other master classes. Yeah. So for example, after reviewing, the R at the end of after blends with the R at the beginning of reviewing. So we're not going to say after reviewing. Instead, they're going to blend together. After reviewing. So this is where all of the training is done in a certain order for you so that you can apply everything and optimize your practice. So here I'm going to read it for you. After reviewing the data, I believe we should adjust our strategy to focus more on customer retention. So notice the emphasis is really subtle. Here, I would say I'm using this one because I want to point out that this is my solution. Maybe, and this is a meeting and people are saying what they think should be done. So I would say, I believe. This means I either want the credit for the idea or everybody's contributing different ideas. So this is one way to practice it. Now here, we're going to emphasize different words and see what that does. So go ahead and pause the video and read it on your own. And then I'm going to read it for you. Okay, so this one's a little bit different. So if we go back, we're just shifting the emphasis. And this is to show you, again, that this is not an exact science. It really is about your communication goals. Here, I want to make sure you know that this is my idea. Here, after reviewing the data, I believe we should adjust our strategy to focus more on customer retention. So maybe here, other people were talking about a different kind of retention, and I want to bring the focus, the emphasis on the customer retention. Here, it's not really so much about ownership of this is what I believe, more so maybe this is more of a contributing as a team kind of idea, so I don't have to focus on the I as much. Maybe the data is the important part. So sometimes it makes a big difference, and sometimes it's very subtle. What's really important to understand is that sometimes this is where you realize, oh, this is why I get the feedback that I'm a little bit aggressive. Because sometimes people will get feedback and they'll come to me and they'll say, I don't understand. Like, I think I'm being really nice and polite, but my feedback is always, I'm too direct, I'm too aggressive. Sometimes it's because of the intonation. And when you realize that, this is what I mean about being able to be yourself. You're like, oh, I don't want to be mean and aggressive at work. I want to be productive. I want to be a good leader. And so sometimes by working on our intonation, it's even more powerful than learning more words. Most people think, oh, I need more English. At this level, of course, we all want more English, but the intonation practice is actually going to get you a lot further. This will help you sound more diplomatic, friendlier in the times that you need to be friendly, authoritative when you need to have more leadership. This is going to help you do that better because it's not about more complex grammar. It's about the delivery. So now we went from a casual conversational example back to a professional business English example. So you want to visualize yourself reading this and you're talking to, let's say, a coworker. Go ahead and pause the video and read it out loud. Okay, good. So by now, it should feel smoother. By now, what I'm hoping is you're realizing that you're naturally breaking this up in chunks, even if you're not physically moving them. By now, you should realize, oh, I'm taking little micro breaths, at least at the beginning and the middle. If nothing else, at least that. That's going to make it easier. If you're saying this whole sentence in one breath, A, that's exhausting, but B, imagine all of your sentences that way. It's not sustainable. It's not natural. So this is where you start catching and optimizing your practice. Okay, so then we're going to visually divide it. Remember connected speech. Remember the rhythm, the linking, the blending. All right, go ahead and pause the video and read it out loud. Now for this one, now that we were aware of the rhythm, the breathing, connected speech, something that you're going to add to your awareness is reductions, so you can sound more natural. If you don't remember reductions, go back. I think it's one of the first, maybe like middle master classes, and review that lesson. A great example here is instead of saying, I wanted to follow up, we're going to have the connection of follow up. So that's going to sound smooth. But instead of saying to, if you recall from the reductions masterclass, Americans usually say tuh. So let's see how that changes this. I wanted to follow up. I wanted, because then the T kind of disappears a little bit. I wanted to follow up. I wanted to follow up. And then here, even though we separate it visually, it's okay that sometimes you're still going to have some connection. So follow up on, even though I divided it, it still has an opportunity for connection because we have the p at the end of up and the vowel of on. Follow up on. You can still connect, but there's going to be that rhythm. It just helps you visually to sound more natural. So I wanted to follow up on our, and maybe you want to pause it completely. I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last week. Now, because we're emphasizing last, you hear the T a little more. However, if we're not emphasizing last, a lot of times Americans will drop the T and it sounds like last week. So sometimes these are subtle, little quirky things that Americans do. Regarding the upcoming project deadlines. So here you want to visualize maybe there are other components of the project that you could have discussed, but you want to focus on the deadlines. All right, and now we're going to play around with it, shifting the emphasis. Go ahead and pause and read out loud. All right, now for this one, maybe visualize yourself, instead of to your team member, maybe it's to the CEO of the company if that's not you. And so maybe you're a little nervous or you want to be a little more diplomatic. It's up to you, but I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last week regarding the upcoming project deadlines. So there's just a little more deference. There's a little more diplomacy. It's an option. All right, so here it's really important to know that sometimes it's about the message in terms of what words you emphasize, and sometimes it's just about mixing up the practice in a way that helps you play around with your voice and find your most confident self. Sometimes you'll notice wow, I cannot say it clearly if I'm emphasizing this word, or I get confused on the connected speech if I separate the first and second line. Great, then don't separate them. Make it so that you can say it naturally. This is not an exact science. This is really about personalizing your practice. So whatever doesn't work, don't force it. Find a different way. All right, so for this one, go ahead and pause. We're going back to a conversational example. So now you're talking to a group of friends. So now you know what the topic is about. What I'm hoping by now that you're doing is you're opening your mouth more comfortably. You're giving your mouth space to make all the remember, pronunciation is very muscular. All these master classes have been to train your mouth muscles and your tongue. So hopefully you're able to feel confident pronouncing each word. You're starting to feel the smoothness. The other thing is I'm hoping at this point you're feeling less anxiety. I hope you feel less, I need to do this correctly, and instead, oh, how am I going to say this? I hope by now you're starting to get curious about how you can be yourself instead of anxious about how to say it perfectly. And if you still feel some anxiety, now you know that this is where you want to work on your breathing, relax, maybe take a break, go dance a little bit, come back to it. It's about finding you in English. So here we're going to divide it up this way. Now this one looks a little bit longer just because the words are bigger. It happens. So here, go ahead and pause and read it again. Good. So for this one, you want to focus on, notice that I emphasize downtown. So maybe this restaurant has an uptown and a downtown location. So I want to focus on letting them know I'm talking about the new downtown one. I'm highlighting supposed because I'm like, I don't really know. This is what I've heard. So I'm highlighting that I'm not responsible for the information, but this is just what people say. Whereas, let's change this around a little bit. So maybe there's only one location, and so I want to focus on highlighting that it's new. Go ahead and pause and read this. So by now, as you're doing this practice, I want you to check right now, how are your shoulders? Are they relaxed or are they tense? Check your body. How's your posture? Are you curved in trying to read the computer or the phone, or are you standing confidently? Remember, how you practice English and communication is how you're going to do it when you're not thinking about it. So the more you're mindful of all these things like breathing and posture, you won't have to think about it later, but you'll look really good and you'll sound really good. Okay, so now we're going from friends to business. So now you're in a meeting, and let's say you're talking to a client and you're trying to give them an update on a project and how your progress is going to be. So go ahead and pause and read out loud. So by now, your shoulders should be more relaxed. You're kind of seeing what I'm hoping by now you're seeing is you're recognizing patterns without having to see them. You're not seeing things broken down or words emphasized, but with all the practice, I feel like you're kind of understanding where you have an option to emphasize. Maybe here, like, oh, we should be able to. Now you're like, okay, I like the word should to emphasize. So you're starting to feel not only the American intonation, but your rhythm. Okay. So now we're going to break it down this way. This is one option. And go ahead and pause and read. Now, at this point, what some people start realizing, and this is where you want to play around with the method, because at first, it's a light bulb. You're like, oh, okay, now I can see where we break it down. But sometimes, and I want you to analyze it, this is you, at this point, when you realize how to break it down, what can sometimes happen is then you become overly dependent on it and you shift back into that robotic voice. So if that's you, relax. And some of you might feel like, okay, you know what? I really like breaking it down into 2 to 5 words, into chunks. But highlighting a specific word every line is actually more confusing than it is helpful. So this is where I want you to really lean into what is right for you. So if that's more distracting than helpful, or it's causing you to be more robotic, then don't highlight a word. Maybe for some people, what I do is when they don't, if it's too robotic to break it down into chunks, what I do with some of my clients is we leave the sentence this way. And wherever we kind of want to break the chunk, I just put a line. So then we don't mess with the physical structure, but I put a line where the person can breathe or where the chunk might end. So this is where you want to figure out what works for you, and whatever is distracting or not helpful, then you stop doing it. So here, let's go ahead and play around with the intonation here. Go ahead and breathe. You're talking to a client. Pause and read. Good. So now I'm going to read it for you so you can kind of see where you are in terms of the progress, where you are in terms of reductions, the linking and blending, the connected speech, where you are in terms of the rhythm. Are you finishing every line like a robot, or are you allowing yourself to smoothly go into the next one? So if we can finalize the budget by the end of the week, we should be able to move forward with the project on schedule. So notice that week, forward aren't really super emphasized. So maybe there you just don't highlight anything if it feels normal or okay with you. Now for the pronunciation of schedule, let me put myself bigger. A lot of people struggle with this word. Now the D sounds like a J. Schedule, like jewelry, schedule. And this is the American pronunciation because you'll hear British people pronounce it differently. It's okay. So going back up here, if we can finalize the budget, so here I'm thinking, okay, there are a lot of different moving parts with this project, but at least if we get the budget done, we can move forward. So that's why I'm emphasizing that. If we can finalize the budget by the end of the week, we should be able to move forward with the project on schedule. So notice that I emphasize project by slowing down. This is a big sentence. If I'm saying it to a client, I don't want to rush through stuff because then they're not going to understand me. No matter how perfectly you pronounce your words, if you're speaking too fast and you have no intonation, it's very hard to decipher, to understand the message. Now, for this one, this is more conditional, like if. So if we can, maybe I'm having more doubt, like I don't think this is going to happen, but if we can finalize the budget by the end of the week, we should be able to move forward with the project on schedule. It's very subtle, very subtle. You want to just play around until you find either what works for you in terms of the intent of the communication or what works for you with your personality. So then that's the goal. That's what I want for you, where you realize, oh, okay. And sometimes you have realizations of like, oh, that's why I had a hard time communicating with this person, or they didn't understand me. You realize like, oh, maybe it wasn't my English, but it was my delivery. It's really empowering because then you realize like, oh, you have a lot more in your control than you think. And it's not about learning more grammar. It's about using what you have already and using it better. So this happens to the best of us. Pause and read. All right, so now you know what the sentence is about. In fact, now that you've gone through all this practice, I want you to pause and read this again. Before we break it down and highlight anything, I want you to see how you read it differently with one more time this way. So here what you should be noticing is that you're already self-correcting. Even without the visuals to help you, you probably already kind of picked a different word to emphasize. You kind of already felt like how you would say this in a casual conversation. So that's the goal. That's where you should be right now. All right, so now we're going to break it down visually. Now, what I did here is instead of highlighting the full word, I actually highlighted the syllable of the word that I think I would emphasize if I read this naturally. So go ahead and pause and read. So here I'm giving you another method. Sometimes for the people who, if I highlight a full word, if that is overwhelming or distracting, or it causes people, if you're one of those people who ends up going louder, sometimes this is a good alternative. Instead of highlighting the full word, highlighting the syllable of the word. So I was planning. Sometimes that helps refine. It's just a different way that you can visualize to help you get the right rhythm. So I was planning to go to the gym this morning, but I decided to sleep in instead. So there, if you feel like, oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense to me, or maybe you think that's still distracting, or okay, it helps me if I highlight the planning and decided, but the other ones were too much. That's okay. Highlight whatever works for you. So I want you to be as flexible as you need, because sometimes it can be distracting. For me, if I was doing this for myself, I would probably only highlight, I was planning to go to the gym this morning, but I decided to sleep in instead. So I would probably highlight the PLA, the CI, and in. And that would be enough for me to sound natural. So when you have these more casual sentences, playing around with your humor can be really helpful because, for example, for me, I feel like I'm a lot funnier in English than I am in Spanish. My sense of humor, I feel like I'm just not used to applying it in Spanish as much. I'm a lot more sarcastic and playful in English. So it takes more practice for me, even though I'm a native speaker in both languages. So here for you, this is where I want you to take the opportunity. Are you sarcastic? Do you smile when you're joking? Because sometimes what I find happens when non-native speakers try to make a joke, they're so worried about saying it correctly that they don't give any facial expressions. And so then the native speakers, they don't know if you're joking or not, so they don't laugh out of respect. So this is where I want you to practice. Make sure you have a mirror in front of you, record yourself. Can you tell that you're joking? Because if you can't tell, let me tell you, the people you're talking to definitely can't tell. So this is when you realize, oh, that's why nobody laughs. It's because they didn't know. So this can be very helpful for you to modify. Sometimes you could play around with recording yourself saying it in your native language in a funny way, and then saying it in English in a funny way, and see if you're allowing yourself to have the physical context cues for others. Can be very helpful. All right, now we're going back to business English. Here for this one, the current market conditions. Okay, here I want you to be the CEO and you're talking to your company and you're giving them what you're going to do this quarter. All right, pause and read out loud. So already by now, you should notice that it's a lot easier to switch into the mode that you need. The reason I picked conversational and professional examples is because I want you to feel who you are in both. In the same way that in your native language, you can be more casual and playful with friends, but you're more, maybe more serious or direct at work. We're playing around with how can you be that way in English as well? If you're in a leadership position, how do you show that leadership through your intonation? And this is what we were talking about before. I don't want you to be aggressive. I want you to be confident with your authority. Okay, so for this one, now we're going to break it down. Here, I kind of did a combination of both. Again, showing you how flexible this is. Sometimes it might be helpful to highlight the syllable. Sometimes it might be helpful to highlight a word. Sometimes you don't want to highlight anything and you just want to break it down. Maybe you don't want to break it down and you just want to highlight. Make this tailored to your learning style. Okay, so pause and read. So here you want to check, are you falling back into robot voice or are you allowing yourself to visualize? You're sitting at the head of the table in the conference room. You're talking to like 10 or 20 directors in your company. How do you want to be perceived? Do you want to be, given the current market conditions, we might need to reconsider? Or given the current market conditions, we might need to reconsider our approach to launching the new product. So you really want to, this is why I love recommending recording yourself. Even if you don't like your voice, everybody tells me, I hate my voice. I don't like looking at myself. That's fine. You don't have to like it, but you can still use it. Because then you really get to hear it and think, oh, that does not sound like I thought I was sounding. So you're able to play around with the intonation practice now that you have the tools. Great work. I'm really proud of you. Now I hope that you realize what I meant with the beginning with the mindset. Sometimes when you're doing this kind of practice, it can feel overwhelming. Like, that's great when you tell me, Tanya, but myself at home, how am I supposed to know this? Now you know. By doing this practice, watch this masterclass again if you need to. Practice it more. Maybe do the masterclass and then come up, ask ChatGPT for more sentences. You want to customize it. And you'll notice I have that prompt next in this module. And you'll be able to copy that for more examples. If you want to use this practice for more conversational examples, maybe you really want to work on small talk, you're going to ask ChatGPT, please give me small talk conversational sentences that I could use with my friends or with the parents at the pool when my kids are swimming. You want to be really specific about the examples and you'll be able to practice. But now you know enough so that you can understand how to practice. Remember, you don't have to memorize any rules. It's just about becoming more familiar with it. This will also help you observe differently. You'll be able to observe more effectively because now you can know, like, okay, every 2 to 5 words, where are they going up? Where are they slowing down? It's amazing what you'll start noticing, and then you'll be able to apply that to your practice as well. And as always, for any American pronunciation, business English, or leadership communication resources, go to tanyasuarez.com. Thank you so much for doing this practice with me and for trusting me with taking you to the next level.